Hello, this is Madeline Raglin. I will be presenting the 12 core functions in counseling based on my experience at Bronco Treatment Center in Mustang, Oklahoma. Now, this is an inpatient DHS operated facility, so a few things work a little bit differently regarding counseling and the clients in general than maybe they would in a private practice setting or an outpatient setting, but it was a wonderful learning opportunity. So, the first core function, screening, I personally did not engage in the client's initial evaluation, but I was given two reports before my intake session with each client. So the first report was a report from the client's caseworker explaining client history and previous diagnosis. So the history would include any problematic behaviors in the past, current behavioral problems that are problematic, um, trauma that the client's been through, poor relationship patterns, abuse that the client has experienced, even a client's interactions with previous therapists. There were several clients who had been violent physically with other therapists. So, just giving the therapist some information that she could use in the intake sessions to kind of begin building rapport with the client and kind of understand the client before she is in a room privately with her. The second report was a report from the Bronco Treatment Center's psychiatrist, Dr. Jarman. And these reports were based off of her evaluation of the client when they first entered the facility. So she is the first person or mental health professional to see the client, and she evaluates them. Um, Kind of gets a history as well, and then she diagnoses them. She kind of determines whether they're going to stay on the medication they're currently on or if they are going to have any added medications, and she sees them on a weekly basis. So this usually none of this is changed based on her first evaluation, but she does give a report to the therapist just to make sure that the two reports kind of line up as far as how the therapist plans to proceed with the initial intake. And the admission criteria is that the client must be in DHS custody because obviously this is a DHS run facility. And the only reason clients really get placed in this facility is because of unhealthy behavioral patterns. So they need behavioral redirection in some way, and some of this could be violent behavior, some of this could be sexually acting out behavior, some of this could be self harming behaviors. Regardless of what it is, it's unhealthy behavioral patterns that kind of makes the client uneligible for a bed in any other foster home facility or more liberating DHS facilities. So this is a level E secure facility that the clients come and they work on their behaviors, emotional regulation, and all that kind of stuff. Second core function, intake. Now, this process, in my opinion, took a really long time. Um, and this is the only place I've ever worked in as far as mental health facilities, so I'm not 100% sure if this is normal. Usually, the intake took about 2 sessions with these clients, and the sessions are 1 hour, and it's just extensive paperwork. Usually, the mental health professional, the therapist, will do the paperwork with the client, and a lot of times she will fill it out for the client. Usually, this was me if it was a client that I was assigned to. But there were so many that sometimes, even halfway through the session, the client would even ask, "Can we please take a break?" A lot of their attention spans when they get there are not great. A lot of them are coming off of hard drugs. A lot of them are coming from direct traumatic experiences and all kinds of stuff. So, what I did for the clients that I saw was I kind of let them lead the intake assessments as far as like if they were just done with filling out paperwork and answering questions, especially questions that were extremely personal and really none of my business in their eyes at that time, I would let them stop and we would listen to music or do an art activity or something in that session where we started the intake so that they realized that I would respect their boundaries and they would move forward in respecting mine. So, some of the intake assessments, or actually all of the intake assessments, included a recreational slash vocational evaluation. This one just kind of explored their experience in life with work, with their dreams, with their even their desire to participate in groups versus being individual. It it really revolved around assessing their strengths and their passions. And it was just, this one is just a really great way to start the intake as well as get the clients talking about some things that they love. I think this is really great in the rapport building when you can stop and go through this evaluation and just help the client dream a little. The second one was the Casey Life Skills Assessment. This kind of, at times, was a complicated one. It was pretty long, several pages, and you would ask the client, do you know how to do this? And their answers were yes, somewhat no, or no. And um, it kind of became apparent as I saw many clients that this process, they would just either answer a bunch of yeses and a bunch of nos. So I started kind of getting a little deeper with this assessment and saying, if they said, yes, I know how to use online banking, I would say, oh, can you explain the process to me? So that the assessment was an accurate demonstration of the client's actual skills rather than just them saying yes and no to get through the however many pages it was. We also did a drug use questionnaire. And this was just, obviously, it's kind of self explanatory. We asked them questions about current and past drug use, and even a desire. We evaluated their desire to continue sobriety or achieve sobriety, or we just kind of looked at that. And I based a lot of whether I wanted to do drug use psychoeducation with these specific clients on this questionnaire. If the client said, I've never used substances before, I would ask them, well, why haven't you used substances before? Have you never had the opportunity, or you don't want to? And so it just was a good indication on whether um, we needed to spend time on this in therapy, which most of the time the answer was yes. Then we did a child and adolescent trauma screening, and this was just kind of the clients explaining and going through a checklist of different potential traumatic events that they had experienced. This kind of gives the therapist a good indication of um, just the trauma that the teenager, or I mean the children in this treatment center can range from 11 to 18. So it just kind of gains an indication of, yes, this child has been through this kind of trauma. And also it indicates like how the trauma affects them today. It allows them to rate how much it affects them in their sleeping patterns, in their ability to enjoy life, etc. So then we did a mini mental state examination. This was my favorite one. I always enjoyed doing it with the clients. Most of the time, the questions were pretty simple if the client had a relatively high IQ. And we would just go through them. And sometimes the client would laugh at some of the questions. And it was just really, at times, a little piece of rapport building that we were able to laugh together and talk about how silly some of the questions are. Other times, there were, a few times where we had clients with extremely low IQs and they did not score highly on this at all. And so we just kind of went through it and they did their best and we moved on. But most of the time, this one provided a little bit of a laugh and allowed us to just kind of say, you know what, we have to do this to make sure that you, where you are. And so they would usually willingly participate in this, and it kind of broke up the monotony of drug screenings and trauma and all of that. So even the clients themselves typically enjoyed doing this one just because it broke up the monotony. Then we did a DSM-5 self-rated level 1 cross-cutting symptoms measure where the client just self-reports on any symptoms that they may have based on um, this measure. It was pretty simple, pretty quick. Most clients didn't mind doing it. They just kind of wanted to hurry through it. Finally, we did an integrated assessment, which was the longest part of the intake process. Thankfully, based on some of the reports from Dr. Jarman, the treatment center psychiatrist, and the client's caseworker, some of this stuff could be filled in before we even got to the client. So we didn't have to necessarily work on it with the client because it wasn't self-report. It was based on, history and stuff. So thankfully we could fill some of this out for the client before we had her in there for an hour doing all of these different things. But that integrated assessment did include the client's demographic information. They would report on their treatment expectations. Usually the reason for admission summary was filled out based on the report from Dr. Jarman and their caseworker. And then they did a self-report / observation where they just kind of reported on different questions and stuff. Behavioral information, again, that was typically already filled out for them. School information was usually, it passes on through the DHS system, so that was already in there for them. Substance abuse history and current use. If the therapist or I knew any of this based on the reports we were given, we would include this, but we always ask the client because not everything is going to be listed in a report. And oftentimes there were reports from clients about substance abuse history, both with them and their families, that we were unaware of before they got to the session. Early sensory issues were kind of already put in there based on the history. Personally, I don't think these clients really would know what that means, but we might look at it just depending on the report that was given based on their history. Trauma history information, we allow the client to report on this. We might fill out a little bit based on what we know, but the client ultimately is given the floor to talk about this and give any history that they think we should know, that we should work on in therapy. Relationship information, sometimes relationships are mentioned in reports, but clients know themselves best, I believe. And most clients would include relationships that are important to them in this report that were not in the history or were not in the assessment. Or maybe there was a report of unhealthy behaviors with certain relationships that the client still reported to be important. So, for example, one of my clients was molested by an older brother. And so that brother has no contact with her now, but the client still reported that that relationship was really important to her and that she loved her brother and wanted to see him after she was 18. Well, obviously, when we talk about those two scenarios, that needs to be addressed in therapy at some point, not right away, but just having that mental note and that report kind of helps to know where the client is in their unhealthy relationships and how they view their trauma and oftentimes how they view the perpetrators of their trauma. Then we did an integrated clinical summary, which typically was just done after the client left. Mental status exam, just to kind of go with the mini mental status exam. Preliminary diagnosis, which were done for the client before she entered. And then a personal safety plan where we can look at how can we ensure your safety to the client moving forward, even after you leave here? What can we work on while we're here? Sometimes the clients would have a lot to say, and sometimes they wouldn't on those. All right, number 3, disclosure to the client. The methods used for disclosure are include orienting client goals, communicating limitations, and communicating rules for conduct. The therapist usually directly asks the clients about areas that they see need for improvement. Not always do clients see need for improvements, excuse me, but sometimes the clients do give some pretty good insight. The therapist will also explore the client history and help that client identify unhealthy behavioral patterns that must be adjusted in order to be recommended for discharge. And since this is the first time I'm mentioning being recommended for discharge, since these girls are mandated to be here, they have to be recommended for discharge by the therapist and by the treatment team before DHS will take them and try to find them new placement. Communicating limitation. The intern or I myself would explain, usually with the therapist in the room, that I am under supervision and that I will be tag teaming with the actual therapist at the center. So if the client needs anything, they're still assigned to that therapist, even when they are seeing me individually or for groups or whatever. So they know that they have kind of both of us in their corner during their stay. Um, Also, the therapist or I will explain that to be recommended for discharge, the client must be willing and open to work their program. There are several different facets of the program, um, therapy obviously being one, but they have to be willing to put in the work in all areas to be recommended for discharge. They have to be working on the behaviors that ultimately have placed them in this facility. Then we will communicate rules for conduct. It's not really easy to do therapy if girls are um, wired or, you know, aggressive, and this happens very often. But the therapist or I, either one, we usually tag team, especially in the intake sessions. We will explain that mutual respect is required and that the therapist or the intern reserves the right to end a session early and note a refusal if the client is disrespectful. And I really, really hate having to dismiss clients from therapy, but there are times when it is obvious that the escalation that is occurring is not going to come down until the client changes their setting or circumstance. So there have been a few times where the client became mad for whatever reason. And like I said before, some clients have had a history with being violent with therapists. Thankfully, that was not my experience ever during this time, but um, if the client was just too escalated or too disrespectful or began being destructive towards property in the office, I would tell them to leave. Sometimes I would go back out on the floor later in the day and just sit with them and try to mend that rapport. But ultimately, the client knows from the beginning that the therapist or intern has the right to ask them to leave. And if they are too disrespectful and not participating in therapy, then they will get a refusal, which ultimately results in consequences, being suspension of all privileges, loss of level, which the girls have different levels that they can achieve during their program, with different freedoms and rewards. They just have different consequences for different behaviors, but SOAP, which is suspension of all privileges, is the most common. Continuing the disclosure, more methods include explaining the programs, orienting the counseling process, and explaining confidentiality. So, explaining programs, the therapist or I would explain the importance of working the inpatient program as a whole, not just therapy, not just day to day, all of it. Therapy is considered the top priority, and the client cannot be recommended for discharge without the therapist's approval. orienting the counseling process, the therapist or I explains what the client can expect. We explain intake paperwork. We explain to them even after intake paperwork, just to kind of break up that paperwork monotony. We let them create a bag to keep their therapy projects in, treatment activities that they can kind of expect to see, and how being recommended for discharge will work. They cannot be recommended for discharge until they've been there for 90 days. After the 90-day evaluation, the therapist and the treatment team will get together and they will kind of determine whether that girl is a good fit for here, whether she's improving at all, whether she should be recommended for discharge, or whether she should be referred to another facility because it's just not working. Usually, at the end of 90 days, the girls have put in the work and will be recommended for discharge, and then their caseworker will be released to kind of start looking for a new placement with more freedom. However, there are times when girls are just not putting in the work and they're not recommended for discharge, um, because they didn't really believe that at the end of 90 days they wouldn't be recommended for discharge if they didn't put in the work. In that case, they stay longer. And the third is there are some girls that the treatment center just isn't suited for. They need a different level E or some other kind of facility that specializes toward theirs. And at that point, they will look at a referral and encouraging DHS to find a different bed for them elsewhere that kind of, maybe meets their need better. And sometimes maybe there's girls that no place like this is going to meet their need, and it's really unfortunate and sad to see. But I remember one client that it just felt like, as much as I hate to say it, it just felt like she was eventually going to age out of the system and nothing was going to change her unless she finally just made her mind up that she wanted help. So, finally, explaining confidentiality. The therapist will explain the limitations to confidentiality. Uh, this includes at this treatment center that the client information may be shared with the treatment team if deemed necessary. So, for me, if a client divulges some very deep information that she is confiding in me about and she does not want anybody else to know about, I will not divulge all of the details um, from that session with the treatment team, but I will encourage them, hey, this is how you might handle the client when she is behaving like this, because she has some issues that she's divulged in therapy that probably aren't best to share, but just trust me on this kind of thing. It just helps having that client know that some information may be shared, just helps in her ability to trust the therapist, because regardless, information passes on through there. There's not even like a roof over the office, so if the client is very loud at all, people can hear from the other side of the wall if they're sitting there and it's quiet enough. So it just kind of helps the client be assured that everybody on staff there has her best interest at heart. Um, and then the therapist will also explain her mandate to report anything that may be unsafe for the client or others, self harming, suicidal ideation that is severe, um, plans to hurt somebody, plans to hurt yourself, or try to take your own life. All of those things that are obvious for any counseling student, that are hammered in our minds from day one, we explained to the client. Core function 4, the assessment process. So, Bronco Treatment Center uses a variety of assessments throughout the client's stay in the facility. That we use monthly assessments, we use motivational interviewing, and we use midway assessments. So the monthly assessments include, at the beginning of each month or the end of each month, however you want to put it, just at the month change. The client and mental health professional will review their treatment plan, and the client will report how she feels her progress is coming along, and she will either write it down or she'll have the therapist write it down with her. And This just gives the opportunity for the clients to see their treatment plans, review their goals, look at them, and decide, are these goals what I'm working on? Are these goals things that I'm making progress in? Are there goals that I'm making progress in and other goals that I'm not? And it just kind of both holds the client accountable, but also holds the therapist accountable to be sure that we are working on the appropriate things, especially during the client's individual sessions. Then the midway assessment at day 45. So obviously, there's 90 days before the client is evaluated for a recommendation for discharge. Halfway through the client's stay in that 90 days, she is asked to retake a few of the assessments to evaluate any progress she's made. So, Casey Life Skills, we use a ton of day to day psychoeducation. Um, Based on just life skills. So during group, not during therapy, but they have like sessions called group that the program director will work with them. They may be learning to cook. They may be learning difference between different cleaners that are used in the bathroom versus cleaners that are used in the kitchen. I mean, they just learn a wide variety of skills. They learn money management. They learn so many things that is really great moving forward. And so some of the things that they may have scored poorly on in this Casey Life Skills assessment during intake, they may have actually made some progress in. They also will do that mini mental state exam again. Like I said earlier, some of these girls come in and they are coming off of hard drugs or they're coming directly from severe trauma. Um, it could be a variety of things that cause them to score extremely low on the mini mental state exam, but halfway through, they haven't had any substances that are not prescribed by a doctor in however long. In 45 days at least, they haven't been experiencing, you know, right on the trauma that they experienced 45 days ago at least. So they may be in a more clear headspace that allows them to score better and show progress in the mini mental state examination. Then finally, they also do the DSM-5 self-rated level 1 cross-cutting symptoms measure again, just to see um, whether there are symptoms that are still existing or not existing anymore based on their time at the treatment center and the work they have put in. Continued on this one, range of diagnosis, procedures, and use for evaluation, and strengths and weaknesses. The range of diagnosis is wide within the context of the treatment center. The most common typically include PTSD, lots of mood dysregulation disorders, depression, anxiety. Everyone in there, basically, for the most part, has behavioral disorders, unless they're better explained by PTSD. Autism has been a common disorder within the center. And then also lately, the most recent disorders have been extreme, like developmental delay. We've had a few girls that one was not verbal and one was verbal, but there was evident developmental delays. Procedures used for evaluation. There's a leveling up system that takes into consideration the evaluation of the program director, psychiatrist, and the therapist. So basically, if the girls have had the suspension of all privileges or any of those major consequences, they will not be eligible for leveling up. However, if they're putting in the work every couple weeks, they can be evaluated for leveling up. And for the first few levels, it's like a couple weeks between evaluations. And then for the last few levels, it may be like 4 weeks that they have to wait for evaluation. So I think this is a great program because not only does leveling up enable each client to gain new privileges and freedoms within the treatment center, but it also, some of the privileges that they gain are opportunities to learn new things. So clients in, a certain level might get a privilege to help serve and cook lunch and dinner, or they may have a privilege to help clients manage their money and go with a staff member to get snacks, or anything on those lines. So it's not only privileges, but it's also learning opportunities, which I love. I also like that they're not just evaluated for leveling up, but the clients actually have to fill out paperwork to apply to level up. So they explain why they think they should level up. They have a quiz that they have to take based on the things that they should have learned while they were on the level that they're currently on, and all kinds of other things that they have to report before they just level up. So it's a really good process to get the girls thinking strategically, and the rewards are good, the freedoms are good, and the learning's good in this process. Um, so the strengths and weaknesses. Assessing strengths is fairly simple because the clients are impatient and unable to leave. So they're in those four walls all day, every day. So it doesn't take long before you start learning things that they like, because they start trying to entertain themselves and each other. Even if they don't tell you their strengths, other clients might tell you their strengths, staff members might tell you their strengths. And just sitting out on the floor and evaluating them in day to day life for case management can tell you some of their strengths. Weaknesses, however, are more difficult to find. Um, it's part of the reason the rapport building process is so important. But when a client finally has that rapport and trust built with the therapist, she generally becomes more willing to open up. And then she speaks about her story, talks about things that reveal potential weaknesses. A lot of times with these girls, a primary weakness is self esteem. Continuing on that, problems, needs, and treatment planning and diagnosis. The problems that most frequently occur are behavioral problems in clients. Some of these include self harm, running away, physical violence, and verbal aggression. Consequences on these problems are kind of assessed based on the individual client. Uh, the most important thing is that we're bettering the client. So, consequences, may cause one client to spiral when she's been doing really good. So maybe the consequences are kind of tweaked to help that client better herself and not spiral. Needs, because each girl has a caseworker, and her needs are communicated through the therapist to that worker, their necessities are met. One thing I love about this place is I've noticed no girl goes out without their needs being met. Even when it comes down to having appropriate bra sizes, having appropriate hair care needs for African American girls, um, even things like that that maybe don't always get noticed as needs, they are needs. And every client deserves those needs to be met. And the treatment center and the caseworkers really do work together to make sure the client's needs are truly met, even the needs that go unnoticed on accident sometimes. Treatment planning and diagnosis. The therapist does an initial treatment plan based on the reports given that I mentioned earlier. And then the therapist will discuss their treatment plan and diagnosis with the client to receive the client's input on the most essential facets to work on during her stay at the treatment center. If the client is willing and open to change, then usually it's easy to kind of plan her treatment. If she's pretty resistant, which both are common, no clients alike, but if she's pretty resistant, then the therapist will really work on prioritizing rapport building. Treatment planning, core function 5. Since each client at Bronco Treatment Center is obligated to be there, the treatment planning process varies based on the client's willingness to participate that I just mentioned. So, clients who do see a need for therapy, which there are some, they're involved in selecting the most essential pieces to work. We should be empowering clients to learn how to work on themselves, to learn how to prioritize their self care and their need for change. But clients who believe there's no need, there are clients that think we're the problem and there's nothing wrong with them. There's clients that see a need and don't want to change. I don't know. But the treatment center does work along, and now in those cases, they work alongside with the caseworker to ensure that the proper goals are met before being recommended for discharge. Continuing on that treatment planning, identifying problems, the client's caseworker, the treatment center psychiatrist, and the program director help lead the therapist in identifying accurate problems to work on with the client. Sometimes the client will falsely report problems and things. And so, just to make sure we're working on the right things, we take in the client's consideration, but we also take in the consideration of the other people who evaluate this client on a more day to day basis. Clients don't always agree with the ranking of their problems, but this is handled case by case. If the client is more than willing to work their treatment, then most likely they're not lying about their need for different problems to be adjusted. So we will work alongside the client to make sure their identified needs are met in therapy. Resources. Rapport building helps the client's acceptance of problem resolution and resources. I'm sorry, let me start that over. Rapport building helps in the client's acceptance of problem resolution and resource introduction for helping the client achieve treatment goals for discharge. So when we build rapport, they're more open to accept any resources that we might have, and these vary widely uh, based on the client's circumstances, their trauma, their drug use, their anything. There are tons of resources available at the treatment center for them in their unique situations. Core Function 6, Counseling and Psychotherapy. Bronco Treatment Center requires each client to attend 1 hour individual therapy session and two 1 hour group therapy sessions each week. So one individual therapy session a week, two group therapy sessions a week. Cognitive behavioral therapy is the most typical used. Sometimes when the girls have lower IQs, we just reduce it down to behavioral therapy because cognitive behavioral therapy isn't the most beneficial for somebody who can't um, process cognitively like this model requires. And we also use some reality therapy, which has been beneficial with some of the girls. We don't hold back sometimes and we are just straight up and honest with them. And honestly, that builds rapport with this clientele a lot. When you just kind of call them out on whether it's lies, whether it's unhealthy behavioral patterns, whatever, then you can turn around and use CBT because they see that you see them and you see the true them and that you just want to help them. So when you're just real and straight up with them, they almost respect that more. Group therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy is most typically used here as well within the treatment center. We also do a lot of art therapy and we use games within CBT. Um, to kind of like break up the monotony. We don't want to do worksheets all the time. We want to do any activity that can help the girls either develop coping skills, be educated on different dangerous behaviors that they're experiencing. Even we've even showed them films that they can relate to and better process their experiences, whether it be traumatic events or foster care events or movies about adoption. Anything that kind of goes along with their needs is kind of what we do. Each season, there's a different need because there's a different group of girls. Core Function 7, Case Management, Public Policy, and Advocacy. Sitting in to perform case management activities within the counseling process. I was able to sit in and observe daily activities and interactions in order to gain a fuller indication of clients' personalities, problem areas, and needs. The floor was basically open where the girls are, unless they're in therapy. for me to come sit in anytime I wanted, day or night, to just evaluate how the girls are behaving, how the girls are interacting. Um, I could evaluate strengths and weaknesses that way. Research. I did tons of research during my time here. Um, I would say this wasn't where I would have expected to do my internship, but the opportunity presented itself and I took it. And I'm so glad I did because I learned so much that I did not know before doing this. And especially in the early stages of therapy, I watched a lot of documentaries for like centers and facilities that kind of had similarities to this one and that kind of revolved around the use of therapy in those facilities. I also read a lot of research articles based on the populations as they changed. There were always a new population coming in. Every 90 days, there was about a turnover. So, research just helped me to identify helpful activities that I hadn't heard of or thought of before, and activities that just helped me give the girls effective learning opportunities that, maybe I wouldn't have utilized if I hadn't used research. And this just indicated to me how important ongoing research is. We can never know it all. I think the mental health field is never going to stop evolving. And I think research is so helpful in keeping our clients' best interests in mind and maintaining effective therapy. Continuing on that, function 7, public policy and advocacy. Advocating for these clients is essential in therapy here. There's also a major constant turnover of staff. And so it is hard to keep the staff constantly educated on the client's rights, on how they should be treating the clients. And while usually this is not a problem, us as therapists, we are supposed to be advocates. And if we know that something needs to be done for the client that the staff is not meeting, it's our job to bring it, especially to the treatment team or the program director, to say, listen, this is how it's happening and this is how it needs to change. And we really act as advocates on the client's behalf as well, as far as their behaviors. The staff oftentimes just want to get really mad at the clients because they don't understand their behaviors, when in reality their behaviors perfectly reflect their situation and their trauma. And so it's just so important. Not that the girls are excused to behaving badly, but handling them versus handling a child that comes from a healthy living environment is different. And so it is our job to advocate for them so that they are understood and treated as human beings with respect while they're staying at the treatment center. Understanding ethical standards. Staff within the treatment center do not always know ethical standards, so it is essential to hold them accountable to maintaining appropriate behaviors with clients. Just like I said before, client safety and well being is the number one priority. If it's not, then what are we doing? Core Function 8, Crisis Intervention. Most clients at Bronco Treatment Center have been or still are, most of them still are, in extreme crisis mode. Suicidal ideation. Most clients here tend to have this at some point. To intervene, the therapist uses motivational interviewing oftentimes to gain an understanding of this ideation's severity, and this helps determine whether a client should be evaluated at an inpatient hospital. um, this is essential because we can not only evaluate them and interview them, but we can also use psychoeducation to help them learn new thought processes through CBT oftentimes. Self harm. There are typically consequences for self harm. Suspension of all privileges is the first step. The therapist will help client to identify healthy coping skills and assist the client in putting them into practice. The therapist and client reevaluate the effectiveness of coping skills on a weekly basis. Some clients will say, these coping skills aren't working. Can we look at some others? Some clients have no interest in putting in the work. So, This kind of also varies on a case by case basis, blacking out and physical violence. Suspension of privileges is the consequence for these behaviors. The therapist typically also uses motivational interviewing and psychoeducation about self awareness. Uh, so, to help clients begin to recognize things that cause them to black out and become violent before their emotional spirals begin. So, using some of the cognitive behavioral steps and helping them identify thought processes or events that tend to spur their blacking out violent behaviors that they can't even remember is so beneficial, and helping them identify the coping skills needed to stop those spirals is also so helpful. Factor 9, client education. The primary use of psychoeducation at Bronco Treatment Center involves educating clients, especially via group therapy, about risk factors involved with drug use and self harm. So, the primary avenues for client education, we use videos, we use worksheets, we use art projects, and we even use games. We try to break up the monotony. We try not to, these girls are stuck here day in and day out, some days not even getting to see the sunlight. And I believe it's our job to help them see their worth and the time necessary to be here. So we use videos to not just entertain, but to educate clients and make them think about how they might relate to the film and how they can adjust their behaviors based on how the film worked. Worksheets, these are less common, but sometimes we do worksheets to like help the clients just evaluate themselves and evaluate new behavioral patterns that they can have. Art projects, we use a lot of art projects to help the clients dream of a future, give them hope, and help them identify and project their passions. Games, a lot of our games revolve around building coping skills and healthy behavioral patterns based on their coping mechanisms. Core function 10, referral. Referrals are really only an option here if the clients have an active plan to attempt suicide. Because this treatment center specializes in trauma and problematic or behavioral behaviors that are dangerous, referrals are fairly rare during the client's stay unless the client is extremely suicidal. So, unless we place them in a hospital facility that they are evaluated at and accepted to stay there, clients can't really leave until approved for new placement by DHS. So, that's one area where it's different here versus maybe an outpatient setting is I can't just say, oh, she needs a referral because I can't help her. I have to do everything in my power to help this client because I don't always have that option. Core Function 11, report and record keeping. Bronco Treatment Center requires both weekly and monthly record keeping for therapy. So, weekly records include progress notes for both group and individual therapy sessions. So, each client by the end of the week should have 3 progress notes, 2 group sessions, and an individual therapy session. These progress notes include goals that we worked on, the client's attitude and response to therapy, the theory that we used during therapy, a description of the activity that we used, a level of progress that the client demonstrated, and if applicable, any new problems that the client is demonstrating. Monthly records include treatment plan updates. The therapist will update the treatment plans, but also the client will make note and report, as I said earlier in the presentation, on how they feel their progress has been through the last month. Finally, core function number 12, consultation with other professionals. There are several mental health professionals available at Bronco Treatment Center to collaborate with on behalf of the client, whether this is the program director, the psychiatrist, the therapist, and even therapists on the other side of the building. They're all available if we have questions or need to bounce ideas. Necessary sharing, like I said earlier, in the initial disclosure process, the clients are made aware that the mental health professional reserves the right to share information with the treatment team staff if it's deemed necessary for daily progress. We can't just share it with anybody in the building, but we do share some information with treatment team in order to help further the progress of the client. The treatment team meets weekly to discuss the progress of each client. Each member on the treatment team sees the client more frequently in different settings. So we just kind of look at congruences in the client's behavior, but also things that don't line up. And then mentoring. Like I said, mental health professionals are available for mentoring interns and giving fresh perspectives basically at all times. I've never had a hard time getting feedback from somebody. Finally, the personal reflection. I believe that Bronco does an excellent job of meeting the 12 core functions of the internship or of counseling. Based on my experience, I just think that this can be a difficult area to counsel in. Being effective in counseling and psychotherapy is just so difficult with a population that has experienced so much hurt, so much trauma. And, like I've said through the presentation, some of them just are not willing. If somebody's willing, I believe that this treatment center is so effective in helping them move forward in life. But if they're unwilling, I believe until they open up and are willing to have a rapport built, um, it's just going to be a chiseling process throughout their lives to become whole if they ever do. And I think that kind of lines up with my concerns and challenges and conflicts. It's so hard to work somewhere where, some clients are getting it, but other clients just are not willing. The biggest challenges were disrespect and hardness. I expected when I went and wanted to go into this field that clients would just automatically see my heart and see that I just want to help. And that's not always the case. And I think that was a hard lesson to learn. I'm very anti confrontational, and I have had to learn to be assertive in this place. And I think it's been very good for me, even though it's been a challenge. My concern moving forward is going to an outpatient facility and being like, needing a little more mentorship because I'm so used to working with trauma, severe trauma, and severe behavioral problems. I think my current strengths gained from this experience are a confidence to work with clients who are extremely difficult, a boldness to assert myself when necessary, and also just the ability to integrate different therapy models based on each client's individual need. That has been huge because we can write papers about these different models all day long, but until a client's sitting in front of you and you say, oh man, this technique from this model would be so beneficial for this client, it's hard to really understand how to put it in practice. And there were clients that I did some techniques that I never thought I would do, but I thought, man, this might be worth a try. And they worked. And it's so cool to see. Maybe some things I can work on moving forward is just um, learning how to accept the silence. Sometimes clients are not willing to open up right away, and it's hard for me to just sit there and allow them to process silently. I want to interrupt them and say, "What are you thinking right now?" But sometimes it's really good to sit quietly. Next steps for increasing my competence in preparing for licensure. I have identified a supervisor, and once I get my diploma, I will definitely be applying for the test, hopefully before the end of the year. And then I will move forward in trying to find a job and working towards actually becoming licensed. I'm very excited that this part of the journey is coming to a close, but I am anxiously awaiting the next steps and just becoming who I thought and envisioned I would be all those years ago when I started when I was 18. So, thank you for listening to my presentation, and have a great day.